Great.
You
Okay.
have to wait? I didn't know you had to wait for
I know
it.
that's a pretty crazy thing. I didn't know that you had to wait for it to download, but um okay, cool. So we're gonna have a smaller group today. Some of the Sagely folks are at another leadership meeting and or at an offsite. And I know that we are operating right now without Matt and Austin. So this will probably be the group plus Chris. And today we are going to discuss writing and planning stories. So if we recall the last session that we had where we built our user story map, that was more of like an intro to what is a user story, how does it fit into the agile epic estimation process, and how can we break down stories from large bodies of work down into more granular ones. And the output there was a user story map. Today what we'll be doing is really diving into user stories themselves and how we write them and plan them. So the first step will be discussing how to compose a good user story and elements of a good user story. We'll go through a user story writing exercise to kind of break things up. And then we will talk about how we review and plan stories. So that's iteration planning meetings and pre-planning meetings. And then lastly, we'll touch on other types of work items. So things like tech debt, chores, bugs, all of that, and product backlogs. Any questions before we get started? All right, so jumping into composing user stories. So this slide and content might be a little familiar, but just wanted to refresh how we're breaking down epics and features into user stories. So having a method for breaking down an epic into user stories will help drive understanding with our project and maintain momentum, although we need somewhere to get started. Luckily for us, we worked on our user story map. So we had that as a little handy tool to help us break down features by looking at the activities, the tasks, and the details. Some of the other ways you can go about breaking down epics and features into stories are having a story for each persona, using the steps in the process to break those down and have a story for each step in a potential workflow. Having a specific cultural norm for breaking down stories. So that's not applicable to us because we really haven't gotten into the rhythm. But sometimes if you know something's a quick task, you can write a task for it, or something might typically be a larger story or a feature. And lastly, time, which as I discussed earlier, we don't recommend using time to break down features and epics into stories because that really doesn't drive a beginning and an end. But if you don't have any other option, having a story that you can complete within a sprint could be effective. So we're going to walk through the steps to compose a good user story. So the first is decomposing the feature, like we've already done. So having user story titles highlight a specific user experience and not the feature itself will really drive alignment and make sure that our user stories aren't too big. So it's really important that we maintain small user stories. And because we did that user story map where we had those high level activities and then we were able to see the details down there as well, thankfully, I think we'll be all right here, but it's always important to start with smaller, specific user experiences. The second step is defining the story's outcome. So user stories should represent a vertical slice of functionality. So a user story should include front end and back end components. A user story shouldn't just be like making sure that the screen looks like the design. It should be screen looks like the design and it's hooked up to the database that can send data back and forth. So we want a user story to be able to provide value to our user. And we do that by having back end and front end functionality. The third step is clarify the AC. So we really want to get specific about the steps. Remember, the beginning, the context, the action, and the end. So we want to make sure that within our AC, we're really clarifying what happens before, what the trigger or event is, and then what the outcome is of that trigger or event. And then lastly, wrap it up. So this is where we get into the nitty-gritty details of, what are the technical constraints that we're thinking about? What are the dependencies? What's the copy and media and design we need to be considering? Is there analytics, et cetera? So this is really where a lot of the discussion is around because, the team is thinking about the edge cases, technical constraints, all of those things. And this is really where design and engineering will give a lot of input. Any questions here? And we're going to dive into each one of these steps a little bit further. Alrighty. So the first step that I mentioned is decomposing the feature. So we want to split features into user stories with user-focused titles. These titles should reflect a specific user experience and not the feature itself. So making sure that we're really clear around making sure that it's really highly specific, it's user-oriented, and it's that vertical slice of functionality. So we're going to carry some of these examples through all of the steps. So some examples of non-user-centric story titles might be something like blood glucose notifications, or just a type of notification. That seems like very highly specific and is not targeted towards the user. Something like Tabitha can tap a notification to record her glucose levels, select the date and entire time and submit. Like that seems very long and verbose. Tabitha saves her blood glucose measurements. That lacks context. Why is she doing that? What's the value there? Store Tabitha's glucose level as a record in our database. Like we said before, that's a back-end story. So if we turn those into clear user-centric story titles, we always start with the user. So Tabitha schedules daily reminders to record and check her glucose level. Tabitha records her blood glucose measurements along with today's date and time. Those are specific. It's saying what she's doing and it's user-centric. She receives helpful advice when her glucose levels are outside of the healthy range, and she receives a positive message when her glucose levels are within healthy range. So these also include, we assume, back-end and front-end functionality. So when you're creating user story titles, it's important to think like, what is the outcome you want to achieve when the user is performing this task? Moving on to defining the story's outcome. So we have a good title now. We've identified what a good title is. Now, what's the outcome and what is the description? So user story titles should, and user stories themselves should reflect this vertical slice of functionality and include both back-end and front-end functionality. So when we're looking at the outcome and the description, we want to follow like a super straightforward, simple format. So and you want to include the type of user or the persona, I want, and what specific outcome the user wants, so that, and then the reason for that outcome. So if we're going with the user story title of Tabitha receives a positive message when her blood glucose notification or her blood glucose is within the healthy range, a description or outcome for that story title would be, as a diabetes program participant, I want a positive message when my recorded blood glucose levels are within the functional range, so that I'm delighted to know that I'm on track to stay healthy. So in this case, maybe for us, it's, as a non-kinetic planner, I want to see all of my non-kinetic requests in one list so that I can better prioritize all of my requests. So super straightforward, but it keeps us focused on what the user or persona wants to accomplish. And that will keep us on track to make sure that our acceptance criteria is reflecting the outcome. So one other tip here is being mindful of the wording. For example, nobody really wants like a notification, but they might want to be reminded of something. So think about that. Like, what does the user really want? They might not necessarily want to do something, but they there's a reason for that, and that should reflect our outcome.
Okay, when we're looking at this with a test-driven development, usually like approximately how many tests is good practice for each user story? So I guess what's the scope of the user story? Do I want like a single test per user story? Do I want like 5 to 10?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it will vary on the complexity. So a 1-point story isn't going to be the same as like an 8-point story or a 13-point story. So I think when you get up past like 5, like that's when you start getting complex, and like really we want to focus on like a small sliver of like the valuable functionality. So if all of a sudden you see that you're making like happy paths, unhappy paths, all of these crazy kind of like robust tests for a single story, that might be an indicator that we need to make a user story a little bit smaller. So there's really like not one specific like rule to focus on, but if all of a sudden you're seeing that like you're covering all these crazy edge cases, then that might be reason to go back and say like we might need to make this a little bit smaller.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yep. So the next step here is clarifying the acceptance criteria. So this is really like where the story starts to come together. And it's really like the backbone of our user story. So we really want to be specific about the steps that get the user from the beginning to the end. And we do that with the given, when, then format. So this is pretty much how we will write our acceptance criteria. And it's also going to be the framework for the TDD, the tests that end up being coded, because it's really clear on what the beginning is and what the end is, and then the context and triggers in the middle. So with the format, we start with given. So given a beginning, environment, or context. So given, how have I gotten here? How has the user started this specific task or activity that gets them to this outcome? And then when is referring to an action or trigger for that event when it occurs. And then lastly, the then is the expected outcome that occurs when they perform that action or trigger. So for this example, it's given I'm a logged in member enrolled in the diabetes program, and I've tapped my daily glucose notification, which opens the glucose form in my app. When I enter my glucose level and click submit, and when my measure level is within the healthy range, then I'm congratulated with a delightful and informative message that my levels are within healthy range. So we have a beginning, environment, or context. We know how the person got to this point within their user journey. They've done something which has triggered an action or event, and then there's something that happens with an expected outcome. So when you're writing this, it's okay to have a few ands here. So we have two whens. So when this happens and when this happens, that's fine. If all of a sudden we're seeing a lot of ands and ors and we're getting super muddy and we're having these crazy long AC given when thens, then it might be a sign that the user story is too large. So we need to make sure that we're having a small vertical slice of functionality that provides value on its own. So if that happens, we might want to try breaking them up into smaller stories with their own AC. Now, there might be user stories like Ian mentioned where we have a couple of given when thens. That's normal. So we might have a happy path. So a happy path is, they enter their blood glucose level and click submit, and it's within healthy range. There might be an unhappy path that's in the AC as well. So they enter their blood glucose level and hit submit, and they're in the unhealthy range or something like that, where it's something that like might not be the traditional path that a user takes. So that could also be included in the AC. Now, given the outcome that occurs, say like it's in the unhealthy range, if that's a completely different user flow, then hey, we'll take that unhappy path and we'll put it into its own story. So it really just depends on the outcome and whether or not it's going to be a completely different user journey for our persona. So we mentioned some of these when breaking down acceptance criteria. Sometimes it's difficult to know really where to start. So, if you're having problems figuring out like, where do we start? What's the beginning, environment or context? Here's some other considerations for how you can break down the acceptance criteria. So the first is workflow steps. So it can be pretty clear, and our user story map may have helped with this for everybody on this call, but if there are specific steps that need to happen when they're completing, a form or submitting information, then that can help us break down our AC. We can also use business rules. We discuss happy and unhappy paths. We can look at input options. So if there's like a specific field that we have, and we know that there's, specific validations for those inputs, we can use that along with data types and parameters. We can look at the operations involved, test cases. We can look at the user roles. So, there might be a different path for our non-kinetic planner versus, the non-kinetic requester. And then there are more granular things like browser compatibility. If you have a mobile phone, that might be a different experience if you have like a mobile app or a mobile website versus the actual like in-browser or like computer version of that like website. And lastly, When we thinking about tech debt, it's optimizing now versus later. So, another option or consideration for breaking down the acceptance criteria. Any questions on acceptance criteria, breaking it down, etc.? All right, so wrap it up. How do we put the nice bow on our user story and make sure that it really covers everything that an engineer or a designer might need to know? And this is really where we get into clarifying the details. And a lot of this will be specific to the people on your team, what information they need, how often you talk to your team, etc. So if you're really in step with a team, they might not need as much information. If you work with a team like I have, that's, on the other side of the world, they might need a ton of additional information, notes, and details. So it really just depends, and you'll get into a good flow on kind of like anticipating what you think your team will know. And a lot of this discussion will end up happening at your pre-planning meetings, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. So the first step is reviewing your user story with the designers. So Dane, this will be an activity you do with Chris. You guys will have an informal conversation, like, does this story have the latest designs and mock-ups? What content will the engineers need? So what language are they following or copying? What imagery, what media do they need? And is the AC written in order? So, does the AC match the workflow steps? Does it have a beginning, middle, and an end? Another conversation, and this can all happen at pre-planning with an engineer and a designer, is reviewing the user story with one or two engineers. It doesn't need to be the whole team, just a representative that can speak to some of the technical side of the story. So some things to ask is, what questions would you have if we started today? Does the AC make sense? And will they be ready to estimate the story in planning? So that last bullet I found out is really like that will tell you the most. Because a lot of times you think you're robust, but there are some technical constraints that need to be kind of like worked through that will really be highlighted when we ask that question. So for example, if we're carrying the user story that we've used as an example through to the wrap it up section, what would that look like? So there might be some questions on how we're retrieving the healthy range for our user. Is that based on demographic information, and where is that data stored? Is it in a public database? Is it in a database that's located within the company? That's probably important information to implement the story. How long does a healthy range check take? If it's more than 2 seconds, do we need to put in a loading spinner? So that's why it's good to have an engineer and a designer on the call, because the engineer can probably talk to the loading time and the designer can speak to whether or not the experience needs to include a loading spinner. How are we planning to track in versus out of range blood glucose measurements for diabetes programs analytics? So analytics is definitely something that can be included here. How are we going to track the analytics? Is it going to be just a simple yes, no? Is it in or out of range? Or are we going to actually track the data included in there? And if we are tracking the data, what are the PII, so the personally identifiable information that needs to be or cannot be shared? The last one that could be a question that's brought up is, should we track and connect daily blood glucose notification taps to members in healthy ranges? So that's just kind of one of those fun design ideas that we can kind of track and leave as maybe another additional backlog user story down the road. So from a design perspective, we'll include any relevant copy. So if there's text that needs to be involved, or an image, that would be included, as well as a Figma file. So putting it all together, really, like, this is where the bulk of the conversation is going to happen. A user story is a placeholder for a conversation. So it's helpful to have, come with ideas, come with questions and finished designs to help illustrate the intended screens, and include them in the story details to help keep the conversation going smoothly. So the more prep that we do up front helps us to have the productive conversations in the pre-planning meetings, and then therefore having productive planning meetings. Any questions on this section? Cool. So a quick checklist for success. We've done steps 1, 2, 3, 4. that should make a good user story. So does it have a clear, succinct, user-focused title? Is it a vertical slice that includes both back-end and front-end work? Are the outcomes written from a user's perspective? Is our AC in given, when, then format? Does it include all relevant details and designs / media or copy? And has it been reviewed by the rest of the team before planning? If we've checked all these boxes, then we're probably in a good spot with our set of user stories. And I know we shared this at the last meeting, but don't forget the INVEST framework. If you are struggling with the existing way that you're writing user stories, take a look and remember this framework, which means our user stories are independent and they can stand alone, but still provide user value. They're negotiable, so they offer flexibility on the specific technical implementation. They're valuable, so they're valuable to your team and the user personas. We can estimate them in order to complete them. They're small enough that they're short, but they're also memorable and they're able to fit into one iteration. And lastly, they're testable. So we know how to test them. We know what success looks like for our user stories. So I'm not going to go through all of this because we've basically reviewed this story in individual chunks, but if we put it all together, we have one user story that includes a user-focused title with outcomes and reasons why in the description. The acceptance criteria has the context that's clear, the action and trigger event, and the expected result. It has implementation considerations that have been discussed with the engineers and designers, as well as relevant content, copy, and media, as well as designs. So this is more so as just a takeaway that we can refer to as like a solid user story when you need a good reference. All right, let's jump into a user story writing exercise. So I am going to send this Miro board in the chat. Oops. All right, let me know if you have any issues getting in here. Just double check. Okay, everybody should be able to. All right. So the goal of this exercise is to basically work together as a group and create a user story from scratch using all the elements of a good story. So like we said before, a user story is a way to articulate product requirements, and it's an invitation to a conversation. And we're doing this because by building and sharing stories, we'll get on the same page. So we've done a lot of this process kind of together as a balanced team. This is really where we're going to start to diverge, and Dane's going to start to write stories on his own. So I think it's good to have a conversation when we're writing the first 1 or 2 stories, just so that we all have agreement on kind of like the format of our stories and how we can approach writing a good user story and reviewing a good user story. So we have an example here to refer to as we kind of go down the order, but I think the first step here that we can follow before we even get into writing a user story is reviewing our user story map and our designs. So these should be linked here. Our user story map is what we created last time. So we have all of the high level user activities, which include accessing the landing page, submitting a non-kinetic request, and viewing all non-kinetic requests. And we have some of the stories and details identified for our MVP. Now, like I said before, some of these user steps might be their own stories, and some of the details might be a little bit larger and be stories within themselves. For example, going to the landing page will probably be one story. However, presenting a form with all these fields will probably be multiple stories. So it's a way to organize your thoughts, but there's still going to be some additional work to break it down a little bit further. Now, Dane and I cheated a little bit and had a conversation at our one-on-one, and we just discussed maybe starting with the landing page to practice some user story writing because of the fact that usability testing is still kind of ongoing. And we think that with the group present, we can all kind of agree on accessing the landing page and the flow for that user story. So that's probably where we'll start today. So we have a user story, and we're going to start building more user stories, which is great. We'll have a backlog, but how do we review user stories, plan them, and also incorporate other types of work items? So the first question is like, when do we review user stories? So we review them at our pre-planning meetings. So that's more of a conversation similar to the one that we just had. So those questions that we were just all talking about, identifying dependencies, constraints, etc., very common for a pre-planning meeting. These are otherwise called sometimes like backlog grooming meetings as well, depending on kind of like what type of framework you're using, but pre-planning is fairly common. We also review stories at iteration planning. So usually the stories are a little bit more baked. We've identified and answered most of the open questions, and now we're ready to point them. And if we ever have information on an already pointed user story change, then we'll probably want to bring that back up for discussion with the team and repoint it, since we know that maybe the AC or the given whens and thens have changed. So pre-planning specifically is an optional but highly encouraged planning session to make our actual planning and our IPM more productive. So as long as we've discussed and organized beforehand, we'll have a smoother iteration planning meeting. So usually this will involve a lead engineer, a PM, and a designer, and the three of them will sit down and discuss whether or not there are enough defined user stories for the week, making sure that the user stories are clear so that they'll include relevant designs and that they're in prioritized order. So this is really just like a time to sit down with those three people and just have like a really casual conversation, like, hey, these are the stories that are upcoming. These are the order that we want to tackle them in. Now let's all sit together and make sure that the designs are in order, that we're identifying all the constraints that we have, and that we answer all the questions that we need to prior to iteration planning. So we do this because we really want to save time in our iteration planning meetings. Think of the conversation that we just had. If we do that in iteration planning and we do it, 5 times over for all the stories that we have in a sprint, it's really going to take a ton of time. Where if we break it up and have like a pre-planning meeting and a planning meeting, those should be smaller, more productive, and faster sessions. And it will help just having a smaller conversation with just one engineer, the designer, and the PM versus the entire team. So you're taking away less people by having a small group discuss this beforehand versus having the whole team on for a discussion like this for iteration planning meetings. And we want to ideally do this on a weekly basis. There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to. If we're constantly reviewing stories, it just helps us to all be aligned on what the priority of the stories are. And it means that we're also constantly looking at the designs, and really gives us more of a microscope and a clear eye on the ability to catch things, and the willingness and openness to discuss stories. So doing a effective pre-planning. So how we do this, the first step is choosing the first story. So we want to choose the first user story that we intend to be estimated in the iteration planning meeting. So always starting from the top of the product backlog and going from there. We'll read it together as a group, and if we need to clarify anything as we go, then we'll do that. The next step is to get engineering input. So we'll have the engineers chime in, make any questions, comments, requests, etc. that might be necessary for them, or they might anticipate the rest of the team might ask. We won't want to estimate it right then, but an important question to ask is, would you be able to estimate this story with the information that we have now? Or are there questions that you need answered in order to comfortably estimate this story? Then the third step is revising. So if changes need to be made, awesome, let's do it. If we don't have enough information at all, and we said, there's 5 things that we need clarified, then we'll take it off the docket and we'll remove it from the list of stories prepared for IPM. And then we just filter through for the rest of the stories that we anticipate needing for the iteration. Ideally, we get like 1 to 3 iterations out, but it might be closer to 1. in the beginning because the conversations are going to be a little bit lengthier as we identify everything we need to have a good user story. And then once we get a little bit more confident in our story structure, these meetings will go faster and we might get a little bit further out. So we'll know that we're done when all stories are ready for IPM according to the engineers present. And if we see that we're moving through these things faster and there are less issues identified, we know that these meetings are effective over time. So some quick notes on facilitation is we want to keep it casual. So this shouldn't be super formal. It's really just pulling up the backlog and having a super informal discussion without heavy facilitation. So we really just want people who feel empowered to speak up, to take notes and bring up questions and concerns on stories. We want progress over perfection. So the stories don't need to go in here being perfect. We really just want this to serve as a first pass to catch any issues. And we want to avoid, having a ton of waste and unwanted tangents. So, progress over perfection, as well as the fact that the engineer should advocate. So whoever attends should be advocating for the product direction and really being involved in speaking up. It should not just be on the product manager here to be the one running this entire meeting. And it's beneficial for everyone. So it's good to get feedback on story quality and for everybody to improve as story writers and really think about how we're building the product for our user. So we've done pre-planning, we've discussed all the stories, we've gone through the process, we think we have enough stories ready for our iteration planning. Now, what is iteration planning? So this is the next step after doing the pre-planning, and it focuses on the work in an iteration and creates sprint tasks that our teams must complete. So it's a regular meeting for our core team, and we'll basically understand and align on the work to be done. So we know what our MVP scope is, and we'll be pulling from the top of the backlog to create an iteration plan and have software work coming out of our iteration, working software coming out of our iteration. So why do we do iteration planning? So they help ensure that the product backlog is well understood and reflects the current priorities. So by discussing and sizing all of these backlog items, we'll know what the delivery impact of the work to be done. So basically, we're sizing, we kind of know the level of effort for our upcoming features, and then we're able to kind of start backing into, when could we potentially be ready to release our product. And it really helps clarify what are the top priority features or stories ready to be delivered. And it's similar to pre-planning. It should follow the cadence of product iteration. So ideally for us, that's weekly that we'll do this. And it's held as often as needed to maintain a well-sized and understood backlog. So how to do this? So to run an effective planning, the first step is framing the conversation. So talking about what did we accomplish or what are we on track to accomplish this iteration? So just knowing what we've recently delivered and going through any designs for our upcoming iteration. We'll take the top highest priority user story and read through it, similar to how we kind of read through it and discussed it once we finished writing it. Ideally, everything is clarified at this point, but ideally, realistically, some participants and engineers might ask questions and you'll provide clarifications on the story. We'll estimate the story. So as you recall, we used Planning Poker. I think we agreed on modified Fibonacci, so we'll pull up the planning tool and we will estimate the story. If there is not a consensus on estimations, then we pause, we have a conversation, and we re-estimate until there is consensus on the story. So we'll need to come to a consensus before we can move on to the next story. And if we can't, then we'll set that story aside and figure out in a separate discussion why we can't come to a consensus. Then we repeat for all the user stories planned for the meeting. We probably don't want to go over the allotted time. So if we need to, do a separate session, that's fine. But a lot of times you get a lot less productive if, you're taking 2 to 3 hours a week doing these planning sessions. And then if there are any other work items In the last 10 minutes, we'll discuss those. So probably early on, we'll have a few more technical stories or chores needed early on. So we'll allot time to discuss that and prioritize those in the backlog as well. So success here looks like the team having an understanding of the scope and complexity of the backlog and those items that we discussed. And items should have been added to the product backlogs, which remain sorted according to priorities. So those items added might be those technical stories, bugs, chores, etc. And ideally, the team comes away from IPM feeling aligned and energized about the work coming up in the next iteration. So some notes here on facilitation: use the pre-IPM. This is going to make your iteration planning that much more effective when you've already kind of gotten that first pass out of the way and clarified those questions. Utilize chores when needed. So if there are certain things that need to be done in order to do those user stories down the road that provide value, in terms of setting up a database or, setting up environments or things like that, then we want to utilize those. Don't go too far out. If we estimate too far out, that's really counterproductive. We know things change. We want to bake in allotment for things to change. So we don't want to get like 2 months out in terms of planning and stories. And avoid too much implementation talk. We want to keep the discussion high level. And any deep dives on implementation can probably be done after iteration planning, because we just want to focus, on relative complexity right here and not like fully baked tasking.
Kate, with chores and everything, is that like a user story in itself, or is that just an item that we track in the backlog? We don't need to write a user story to do chores or tech debt or whatever.
No, like specifically for like things like technical requirements, chores / user stories. And we'll have to see how Linear treats it specifically. Like it kind of depends on the system that you use, but usually it's another type of work item that is treated similarly as a user story. So when you decide on the type, you'll pick like tech debt or bug or chore or technical requirement, and it will go through our workflow and be included in the backlog similar to a user story. It's just a different type of work item.
Okay.
I guess
So
with
yeah,
chores,
go ahead, Ian.
oh, sorry. With chores, like what, I guess if it's not including like tech debt or like bug fixes, I guess what type of work item would a chore be? Some like research like XYZ type of thing?
Yep. So a chore could be like researching some type of implementation, and we'll get down to some examples. It could be like improving a build script, etc. But it's basically just like a technical piece of work that needs to be done in order for like a story to be done. So it could be more generic to the product in general, like, implementing our like staging environment. Or it could be more specific, like research how to do this so we can implement, URLs. So it could be more generic, it could be more specific, but it's basically like a technical dependency.
Okay, makes sense.
Cool. So I've talked a lot about iteration planning. I'm sure you've also heard sprint planning. So I wanted to talk about what the difference is here. And we probably want to lean towards iteration planning versus sprint planning. So the difference here is really when it comes down to backlogs and commitments. So in sprint planning, you'll typically set a sprint goal, which means like we think or we're committing to accomplishing and completing these 10 or 11 or 8 stories within our time boxed sprint. And therefore we will pull these 10 stories into our sprint backlog and then commit to achieving that. Whereas in iteration planning, what we're really doing is we're aligning on the entire product backlog and reviewing those stories from top down. And then the team is then pulling those stories as they're available to be implemented from the top of the backlog. So they're very similar in terms of like, we're agreeing, we know what our priorities are. It's just kind of like how we get there is a little bit different. And the activities might be a little bit different. So in sprint planning, you might have an unprioritized backlog, but you'll have like a sprint goal, and you pull the commitment that you've, agreed on into your sprint. Whereas iteration planning, you'll have your whole entire product backlog prioritized And we'll have an estimation of the work that might be delivered because we know our velocity. And we'll be able to demonstrate that at the end of the iteration, but we don't have that like hard 10, 11 story commitment. Questions here? All right. So one more segue into backlogs and other types of work items. So we have already discussed this at our last meeting, but I think it's relevant to bring back up now that we're talking about iteration and sprint plannings. But the product backlog is an ordered list of everything that we need for the product. So it's a single source of requirements and will include changes that need to be made. And the PM will manage this, including content availability and ordering. So each iteration, as I discussed, implements the highest priority stories and features, and then any new request gets prioritized within that existing stack. And like I said, this can include not only stories, but things like tech debt, bugs, chores, etc. Anything that hasn't been started on can change in priority. And if we learn that we don't need anything, it can be removed at any time. And when talking about product
I get-
backlogs, yeah, go ahead, Troy.
So this high value and priority, like is this kind of like speed of able to implement, does that go into this thought process for the backlog at all, or is it just highest value?
It's a good question. So ideally, when we look at our roadmap, we have t-shirt size, kind of like the body of work to be done. So like how we had that like dependency discussion where we t-shirt sized login, submission of the form, and seeing all the different non-kinetic requests. That should inform your roadmap, which will then inform the priority. So it's kind of like, yes, it's baking in because you'll have an idea of like the level of effort to implement a feature, and that will then kind of like fold into how you're prioritizing your roadmap specifically. Basically, like now we know like our highest value features or stories will probably actually be related to like building the form itself to be submitted, and maybe not like the login or landing page, just because we can get that in front of users a little bit faster than a landing page. So it kind of all goes into play, and there are steps in estimation that will inform priority on the backlog. Okay. Moving on to other backlog items to wrap this up. So we talked about chores a little bit. So chores are things that we do in order to enable our team to actually do work and or improve the code base. That can kind of overlap with our technical requirements, which are more factors required to deliver a desired function or behavior from the system to satisfy user standards or needs. The commonalities there, they might not directly have user value, but they have team value or impact on being able to do your work a little bit faster or provide clarity on a user story. Technical debt, this results when we prioritize speed over functionality. So this might lead to refactoring down the road, or like, hey, we know that our system is only going to get 3 requests or 10 requests per day. So we're not going to, put down, we're not going to implement these specific functionalities within our database until we hit X amount of requests. So when we know we'll have to go back and refactor something. And lastly, bugs. So bugs basically means the functionality isn't working per the customer's requirement. So like I said before, we probably won't actually estimate these, but we will prioritize them, because if we're working on bugs, we want it to show and impact our velocity. Are there any questions on specific backlog items? Are there any questions on pre-planning, planning, backlogs, user stories? We covered a lot of content today, so wanted to pause and see if there are any other questions in our last few minutes together. Okay, so takeaways from the discussion today. It sounds like Ian's going to reach out to Austin on some of the technical questions that came up today, and I can send out this Miro board that kind of contains these additional details. I think it would be worthwhile, Dane, if you kind of like take a stab at another story or two on the side and we can work on that together as well to review with the team. And then Morgan, if you get that Kessel Run meeting scheduled, I think that would also be worthwhile. So I think those are the key takeaways from this meeting today. And then I'll also send out some content and the slides in Miro. And we'll start talking about actually getting these rituals scheduled once we're all back from holiday as well. So we'll start doing some pre-planning and planning meetings. Awesome. All right.
Sounds good.
Thank you,
Thanks,
everybody.
Kate. Great job.
Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you.
Thanks.